In this presentation, I'm going to review some of our toolkits that we've developed over the years, primarily working with our different stakeholders, the people we've been doing projects for. So we're addressing multiple concerns with these toolkits, that essentially depending on what environment we're working in and what the problems our clients have had. Right. And I'm just showing you this slide with all the icons, just to give you an idea, some of the people we've actually done projects with. And so these are where these tools are coming from. You know, we've worked with the BLM and NRCS mainly on grazing issues. We've worked with the Department of Interior Interagency BEAR team on post-fire effects. We started developing AGWA working with the EPA, looking at landscape ecology issues as well as non-point source pollution issues. We've also had some projects with the Department of Defense. So we've built tools addressing some of their concerns, okay, in terms of disturbance and potential erosion. So here's some of the tools that we've actually developed. A very important tool, the one that's probably most used, is the land use land cover modification tool. All right, this allows the user to identify an area and change the land use land cover. And we use this tool in a number of our other toolkits, allowing the user to identify an area and change the characteristics of that area, the land use land cover characteristics. And they can use common land use vegetation types, forest, rangelands, urban areas. We can also use monitoring data, including NRI as well as AIM data. We have a tool that allows us to delineate a buffer strip. Not only the area on the stream where the buffer strip is located, but also the width of the buffer strip and essentially the cover characteristics of the buffer zone. And I'll show you an example of that. We have a military training disturbance tool. This was designed, okay, based on a project that we had with Fort Carson, okay, in Colorado. And we're really looking at disturbance related to heavy vehicles, think tanks, all right? And so they can decrease cover, increase the amount of their soil. They can also compact the soil. So again, we built a tool so they could delineate an area, said, we did this training activity here. These are the type of vehicles we ran over there, and then we would predict the potential disturbance from that training. We've developed tools to allow users to put in detention and retention ponds, reservoirs. We call it the Storage Characterization Toolkit. And we make use of LiDAR data to identify where the ponds are located, the physical characteristics of the pond, as well as the depth to discharge relationship. We have a tool called the Multiple Watershed Analysis tool, which allows us to identify an area of concern and identify all the land that drains from that area, all the sub-watersheds conceptually that drain from that area, or what watershed flows through that area. So an example of an application with this tool would be fire. We have a fire perimeter, and so we would use that to identify all the areas that drain out of that fire zone. What is being influenced by the fire? Post-fire effects. Dave is going to have a separate presentation after this one, looking at our post-fire modeling capabilities. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We also spent a lot of time developing tools to look at urban hydrology, urban flooding issues, as well as the incorporation of low impact development techniques like water harvesting. These are green practices. And Yoga, who developed that toolkit, will talk at the end of this presentation. And then Dave already hit on this a little bit, but we, again, can change the characteristics of channels, including channel improvement practices. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, the land cover modification tool. This allows the user to specify the type and location of land cover alterations by either drawing a polygon. So we give you the ability to draw your own polygon on the screen, and then you would change what's within it. Or you can select a polygon, like a pasture, and then you will change everything within that polygon. Okay, and there are different types of land cover change that you can apply. You can change the entire user-defined area to one cover to another. So it goes from, you know, a scrubland to essentially urban development. You can change a land cover type to another land cover type. So you can actually say, I am going to convert one land cover type to another. Okay, or you can specify the percent success of change due to a practice. All right, so if you're doing something like shrub management, we can say we're going to be able to remove 50% of the shrubs in this area. And we would then subtract them, okay, subtract that percentage off what we currently have. And we can cause change to be either random, I'm showing that over on the right-hand side, random, or we do have a fractal tool. So we can actually change the degree of patchiness. So we can go to a random field to something with high spatial autocorrelation, positive autocorrelation. So we have large patches of the same type. So we can do that, okay, with these different options. Here's just an example, a very simple example of the land cover modification tool. Okay, this was done to look at the impact of rangeland change, okay, on an ecological site, a lonely upland ecological site in Arizona. This is using KINEROS K2 with REM. Okay, so these model runs were done with KINEROS with the REM model within it. And so we have two vegetation types here. We had the historical native plant community within this watershed, and then we had essentially a mesquite native plant community. And we went from essentially canopy cover of 78% to a canopy cover of 25%. We had a ground cover of 72%, changed to a ground cover of 40% within this watershed area. So the polygon was the watershed area, and we went from one cover type to another, and we're modeling the change. All right, and we're assuming uniform, okay, vegetation across this area. So this is the results in terms of erosion at essentially at the hill slope element scale, as well as sediment yield at the channel scale related to high to low cover. All right, and so the darker the color, essentially the more sediment yield, the darker the essentially the again, as well as erosion in tons per acre. This is for a 10-year return period event. Now, what we can do with the buffer strip is that the user can identify the reach of stream where you're going to put in the buffer. So in this case, okay, we identified 2 points, downstream and upstream. All right. And then what the tool does, it not only identifies this as a buffer strip area, but it actually separates these modeling. Essentially, it cuts, so to speak. It clips this essentially these two modeling elements and creates two new modeling elements on either side of the stream. All right. It allows the users to select a new land cover and slope for the buffer element. So we're using the capability of KINEROS to have cascading planes. So we have the original upland plane that is going to deliver water, flow water off of it down into the buffer zone. And we can characterize the buffer zone. It can have be a different vegetation type. It can have a higher percent cover. It can have essentially a more shallow slope. Okay, so we can actually emulate the process of water moving from the upper hill slope down through the buffer. Now, I've used this tool in some of my rangeland work where we actually essentially had a new well placed on top of a hill. And then I had actually 3 planes going down to a river. One near the well, but that actually was heavily impacted by livestock grazing. The middle zone that was less impacted by livestock grazing, and then the zone, the buffer zone near the stream, which was not impacted by livestock grazing at all. And we could model essentially the retention of sediment down the slope. So again, this is something you may want to use in an agricultural situation where you're using buffer strips or in a rangeland situation. We spent a lot of time looking at, built environments, okay, urban growth. One tool we can use, one thing we can do is use the land cover modification tool, and we can select an area that's going to be developed. We convert it to an urban type, okay, based on its curve numbers, et cetera, so forth. Or we say 50% of it is impervious. Okay, so infiltration is 0, and then we'll model essentially what is happening as water moves through, okay, or from that new developed zone. And this is just an example in southern Arizona, near Busy, Arizona, where they had a proposed development, and we evaluated the potential impact of that development, okay, for a 2-year, 1-hour return period event on the San Pedro River. Okay, so we then can also incorporate essentially other building designs to try to mitigate the impacts. Okay, less impervious area, more cover area within the urban zone, et cetera. Now, we have another tool that Yoga is going to talk about where we actually go into an urban area. We actually model individual, home lots and route the water through, the urban watershed. Well, we'll talk more about that later in this presentation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on post-fire, but we do have the ability to use a bark map. So we look at essentially burn severity. We then modify, the input parameters based on the burn severity. We decrease essentially the vegetation cover, and we basically define as essentially modify the KS and the overland flow, essentially parameters. Decrease effective the effective saturated hydraulic conductivity, decrease the Manning's end term. All right, and so in this slide we're looking at 2 scenarios, one where 35.4% of the watershed was burned, another where 100% of the watershed was burned. In this case, we're assuming it was all high burn severity, and now we're basically looking at the pre-fire, the upper watershed burn, the entire watershed burn, and what was the potential impact. All right. Well, essentially, again, Dave is going to talk a lot more about our fire effects tool in the next presentation. A nice tool, especially if you have a disturbed area, is a multiple watershed analysis tool. Basically, what this does is allow us to identify an area of interest, and then we will identify all the watersheds that are somehow influenced by that area. Either essentially we drain out of it or we're draining through it. So we'll have an impact downstream. All right. So this automatically locates outlets for all the watersheds that drain an area of interest. It attempts to cover the area with the fewest, smallest watersheds necessary. Okay, and this allows us then to parameterize those individual watersheds that we have actually identified. So this is definitely a tool that we use a lot when we're looking at post-fire response. Okay, the area of concern is the fire zone. We identify essentially the watersheds that are affected by the fire. Okay, we also have used this tool when we're looking at urban development. Okay, occasionally we have an area that is being developed, essentially not adjacent to the current development, but individually within a given watershed. Okay, it's not connected. Okay, so we evaluate the potential impact of that development on the different watersheds. Right. We have a suite of tools that we can use to affect routing. Okay, we can, as Dave talked about, insert a pond, okay, on a drainage system. So we essentially route into the pond and then out of the pond. Okay, we can create diversions and wetlands. We can remove a channel. Okay, we haven't done that very much, but occasionally with urbanization, they will remove channels, and so we have to represent that. Okay, and then, as I brought up earlier, every channel reach can have its own set of parameters. So we can modify the width, the depth, the hydraulic conductivity, the roughness term, the armoring, the compound channel. Okay, and so we can actually represent different management actions that are being done to the channel. So one thing that we've actually developed is a toolkit that we call the storage characterization, okay, toolkit. And basically it has three parts. One is to identify and characterize existing storage. We do that using a DEM, okay. We then calculate the dam's discharge. So we develop essentially the stage or the depth, okay, essentially discharge relationship. Okay, and then we write the files for input into KINEROS. And we basically identify where it is located on the channel system. Sometimes it actually is going to be used as essentially as the initiation point for a channel system, depending on where the reservoir is located. The pond is located. So, you know, one thing that we've actually found is LiDAR, okay, high resolution LiDAR is very effective in identifying where a pond is located. So basically, one of the things we do is that we use the LiDAR, we look at the flow, we create the flow direction, the flow accumulation, and then we identify areas that are sinks. Okay, these are essentially sets of cells that do not drain out. They're basically essentially like a bahada, not a bahada, you know, a dry pond where essentially nothing flows out of it. All right. Okay, and with the LiDAR, we're able to identify, okay, the area behind the dam. You can actually see it there on the LiDAR. What was the volume at essentially a given stage behind this structure? And what is the depth to volume relationship behind this structure? Okay. In many cases, we can see the spillway. Okay. In this case, it's over on the right-hand side. And we can get a depth and a width of that spillway. And so we can actually model, okay, the discharge rate. So we can get a depth to discharge relationship. All right. And so with this tool, you can include within your watershed characterization the ponds that you actually have. And if you're working in the western part of the United States, especially in the rangeland, you know, portion, you'll actually see a lot of ponds. And if you're not including those ponds, you're probably not really characterizing the watershed very well, because they do have relatively high storage capacity, not only for water, but also for sediment. So we've actually shown you this watershed a couple of times, okay, through these presentations. And you can see that we put a pond in essentially one of the stream systems, okay, and we're evaluating in this simulation pre-pond, post-pond in terms of runoff, sediment yield, peak flow, etc. And you can see this is a relatively small pond, and yet you're seeing a negative 15, 16% change in the volume of runoff, almost 10% change in peak flow related to this small little pond going downstream. Dave already talked about this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, okay, application, but with KINEROS, we can partition water in the stream, route it essentially into a pond, route water out of that pond down a drainage way, essentially to another pond, and then inject the water out of that pond back into the channel. So we can kind of emulate a man-made wetland. All right. So if you want to do that, okay, this is one thing that you can do with KINEROS. Okay. We can partition water again out of the main stream and then inject it back into the stream as it flows over this storage facility. Okay. And it's really just looking at a very shallow channel with a couple of ponds, okay, within it. Dave also talked about this. We can emulate out-of-bank flow, okay, on at least one side of the channel. We can't do both sides of the channel, but we can do one side of the channel. And then we can change the characteristics of that overflow area. So we can increase the roughness term, okay, as well as its width and depth. All right, so it really emulates the natural process of dispersed energy, helps filter the sediment out. So we can actually model that. And Dave already showed you this slide. I've used this in some of my work where people were proposing riparian restoration. Okay, and I'm saying, well, if you're going to restore it, okay, what would happen if we had out-of-bank flows in this now restored wetland area or riparian area? So I've actually used this in evaluating some of the best management practices that we were funding to try to mitigate downstream water quality concerns. And one of them was to restore the wetlands vegetation to one of our streams. Another thing you can do is that you can go into a channel reach and you can improve it. Okay. You can clean it. Now, I can tell you in the city of Tucson, they do that once a year. They go in and they essentially clean all the channels within the city of Tucson, removing the logs or the shopping carts so that you don't get local flooding when the shopping cart gets caught underneath the bridge. We can also go into a channel and say we're going to stabilize it. We're going to add soil cement. That would be hardening, armoring the channel so you see less sediment, as well as it would change the slope and change the Manning's N value for that reach. Again, channel essentially hardening, concrete in this case. Okay, so again, that would change the shape, change the Manning's N. So we can do that. We can actually say, we're going to change this reach of channel. We're going to improve it, quote unquote. What would be the potential impact? And that's something that you see in urban areas. And so that would result in increase in velocity, decrease in transmission losses, increase in flooding downstream, etc. So Yoga, you're on.
So I'll quickly give you an overview of the AGWA Urban tool. Basically, the idea was to use the KINEROS model and go down to a small scale where you can model each and every lot or a parcel or a small subdivision in an urban area and use the features of the KINEROS model in doing so. So the idea was to build a GIS framework that was similar to how the AGWA tool was set up, but only that the only difference was it would focus on the urban area, focus on green infrastructure practices, and just deal with that. So the AGWA Urban tool helps you represent lots of parcels and then start representing roofs, driveways, backyards, swimming pools in your yards, and start modeling these components using the KINEROS model. But it also allows you to route flow in a subdivision. So the basic concept is the flow, the water will fall on the roofs and the driveways and the yards, and then the excess water will flow down to the street, and the street act as channels in an urban area to divert the flow from one point to the lowest point in that particular subwatershed. And then the AGWA Urban tool allows you to model green infrastructure practices like retention basins that could be in the yards or along the streets, permeable driveways, or even permeable streets, and also allows you to harvest water that's falling on the roofs into cisterns, and then gauge the impact of these GI practices on the overall watershed hydrology. So the way the tool is set up, it's a step-by-step process similar to how the other AGWA tools are set up. But basically, to begin, you just need two inputs. You need a shapefile with the parcels in your watershed and a shapefile with the streets in your watershed. And using those, you set up a geodatabase and bring them into GIS and start working through the next steps of the tool. It also allows you to route your own flow. So basically, it's a click, drag, and click interface where you can start drawing lines on the parcels to indicate how the flow is going to work. So the assumption is flows from the parcel to the street and down the street. And then you can indicate this flow manually. Now, there are ways you can determine this flow. You could use LiDAR data to get high resolution digital elevation models that can help you determine how the flow might flow in the urban area. Or if it's a planned development, you can start playing around with different flow routes that you can simulate and see what kind of an impact they can have on the hydrology. The next step is the parameterizer. So it's still on the first slide. Basically, you are setting up how big the roof sizes are, how big the driveways are, what are the sizes of the yards, and so on. You're also including canopy cover, infiltration parameters, as well as land cover parameters to set up the model. Then you can start designing your green infrastructure practices and then apply them to each and every parcel. And then finally, you set up the precipitation. You let the AGWA tool set up all the input files that KINEROS requires, run the model, bring the results back into GIS so you can visualize them and see which parcels are generating a lot of rainfall, which areas of the streets are generating a lot of runoff, and so on. So next slide, Phil. So basically, we talked about this plain modeling element in KINEROS, but that gets replaced by this urban modeling element, which has its own subcomponents in it. And these subcomponents help you model those smaller pieces of a parcel. So for example, there's an indirectly connected impervious ICI element that can model the roof area. There's a connecting pervious element that's just straight below the ICI, and that can model front yards. There's a directly connected impervious element that can model driveways. The non-contributing areas can be your swimming pools, which are basically your sinks where the water will fall but not flow out anywhere. And you can also model retention basins for each of these subcomponents as well that intercept the water before they flow onto the street. And finally, when you come down to the street, it's just modeling a street half. So you can have two parcels on each side of the street, and the water flows down, and you can set up a curb cut or a retention basin that will capture water from the street as it flows through it. On the left, in terms of GI practices, you can capture all the water that falls on the ICI into a cistern, and that becomes your rainwater harvesting system. All the impervious areas can be given a saturated hydraulic conductivity values, so that can simulate infiltration on these areas. And then the retention basins themselves can have a volume, and then once the basin fills up, everything overflows. And those are your retention basins, your detention basins, your rain gardens, or even your curb cut basins along the streets. Now, in terms of the flow route assumption, like I mentioned, water will fall on each parcel, and as saturation is acquired, water will start flowing on the street, and then it'll accumulate down the street as well, which is indicated by the diagram in the left bottom left corner. Next slide, please. So just to demonstrate what you can do with this, This is a case study we did in Sierra Vista on 66 residential parcels, as can be seen in the map. Basically, we allocated an urban element for each of these parcels and then determined the roof areas, the driveway areas using imagery, brought it into KINEROS and set up the model so that we can model at that particular fine scale. Now, the blue lines that you can see on the map are the routing lines that the user gets to draw to indicate how the water is going to flow. We draw the lines on the parcels because the parcels are modeling elements, but in reality, the model is going to assume that the flow is off the parcel onto the streets and to the outlet. And the outlet in this case is in the bottom right corner, just above that north arrow. So we did three kinds of analysis for this particular urban watershed. We did a street runoff analysis to see how much water comes off the street. We did a roof runoff analysis where we put a hypothetical 10,000 gallon cistern on each house and try to figure out how much water each house would be able to capture if given the volume capacity. And then we looked at some scenarios where we put retention basins on all the parcels. We converted all driveways into permeable driveways. And we put a 50-gallon cistern on each house to see what that would entail. Now, more details are in the publication that I've indicated on this slide, but I'll show you some of the results in the next slide now. So looking at the street, let's start with the comparison of all the GI practices. So that's the bottom left figure. So basically, black indicates what would happen when there was no development. So this is your pre-development scenario, just the street network on the ground and all the lots are empty. Now, S2, that's green, is all the parcels have a retention basin on it. S3, that's gray, that's when all the driveways are permeable. S4, that's the orangish color, and that's when all the houses have a 50-gallon cistern on it. And then the red is all GI. That means all parcels have all of these GIs in combination. Now, first thing to note that in this area, most of the runoff is in July, August, and September. And that's why you see those tall skyscrapers in the graph. But that's when most of the runoff volume occurs as well. And then what we noticed was the retention basins did most of the bulk work in capturing all this water, mostly because it was large sizes retention basins. And there's also good infiltration capacities in these soils as well. The driveways did not have a lot of area to begin with, so there wasn't a lot of infiltration, and the cisterns were small as well, which did not capture a lot of water and prevent on-street runoff as such. So the take-home message is there is potential of retention basins to capture a lot of water in this particular subwatershed. Now, if you look at the bottom right graph, that's the graph that's showing how much water is coming off the streets and how much water is coming off the parcels. And again, in the months of June, July, August, and September, when most of the rainfall happens in this area, the streets and the parcels had almost a 50-50 relationship in terms of contributing to the total runoff. And that's because the soils on the parcels were reaching the capacity, the infiltration capacity, and you could see more overflow coming off them. But in the in the rest of the year, when there's less rainfall as such, streets were the major contributing factor to the overall runoff, which indicates that if you want to work with GI, streets are the areas where you want to put more basins so that you can start capturing those water, the runoff water. And the last graph I have shows how much water is captured, and then you compare it to the per capita water usage for that particular area, which is Cochise County. And around 70% of the total domestic per capita water usage could be supplemented using roof runoff capture, provided that you have almost a 10,000 gallon cistern. Now, none of these cisterns reached capacity in these simulations, but having that much capacity can supplement domestic water use. And that's something that came out of the case study. So basically, the take-home message from the urban tool is you can start looking at small-scale urban hydrology, look at how a neighborhood will function when you start putting green infrastructure practices. You can even look at just one particular house and see how much water it can capture off the roof. And just the strength of the KINEROS model allows you to do that as such. And yeah, that's the AGWA Urban tool. You'll get to witness that a little bit when you walk through the tutorial tomorrow.